Boneddigion a boneddigesau, bore da a chroeso cynnes iawn i'r Senghenydd. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and a warm welcome to Senghenydd. Rydym yn ymgynnull yma eto heddi I anrhydeddu bywydau y glywir, niferus a laddwyd yn Universal Senghenydd. Mae'n drist oherwydd y pandemig sy'n gafael yn y byd na allwn gynnal ein gwasanaeth arferol. Gwnawn ni ddim gadael i'r Covid a drechu'n cof o'r dynion a bechyn dewr hynny. Anrhydedd talwn ein grogogaeth i'w cof a ran ein noddwr Mr Roy Noble a'r pwyllgor cael croeso twn galon i'r pobl sy'n gwylio. Pobl o'r cwm, pobl o'r Cymru ac yn wir pobl yn y byd. We gather here today to once again honour the lives of the many colliers who perished at the Universal Colliery, Senghenydd. Sadly, due to the pandemic gripping the world, we are unable to hold our usual service. We will not let COVID defeat the memories of those brave men and boys. In their honour, we pay our respects to their memories. On behalf of our patron, Mr Roy Noble, and our committee, may I offer a warm welcome to the people watching from the Valley, from Wales, and indeed the world. On the 24th of May 1901, 81 men and boys lost their lives in the Universal Colliery explosion. Lessons were never learned, and on the 14th of October 1913, 439 men and boys were to lose their lives along with one of the rescue party. 20 of those boys were aged 14 years. 19 of those lost remained below the ground. Their bodies never recovered. Graves in local cemeteries are marked with minors only, as their names were not known. It is a solemn reminder of the price of coal. If I may be allowed, my own great-grandfather, Evan Hopkins James, was one who perished, and I recall my grandfather telling me how he, at just 13 years of age, helped carry his father's body home in the family tin bath. The people of this valley will never forget those men and the families they left behind. If we are to have a future, it is important to always remember our past. May they have peace, perfect peace. Hedd, perffaith, hedd.
The University Colliery Senghenydd was owned by the Lewis Merthyr Consolidated Collieries Limited. It was part of a huge mining empire run by Sir William Thomas Lewis, the first Lord Merthyr of Senghenydd. The sinking of the colliery began in 1891. Two shafts were completed, the York and the Lancaster, both almost 2,000 feet deep. The workings were divided into two areas, the west side and the east side. Each side was divided into a number of districts. The west side district reflected the times of the sinking because they were named after battles of the Boer War: Pretoria, Mafeking, Kimberley, Ladysmith, Botanic and West York. When people talk of the Senghenydd disaster, they usually refer to the 1913, but it should be remembered that two disasters have occurred in this pit. The first was in 1901, when 81 men died. Mercifully, it happened at the end of the night shift when many of the miners had been brought to the surface, leaving just 82 men underground at the time of the explosion. The second disaster at Senghenydd happened on the 14th of October. This took place at 10 minutes past 8 in the morning, just after 950 men had descended the pit and began to work the morning shift. A huge blast sent the 2-ton cage shooting up the Lancaster shaft from the pit bottom, tearing the head of the banksman in the riding gear and wrecking the pit head. The explosion and fire which followed was concentrated on the west side of the pit. The men working on the east side were brought to safety on the surface, but the west side the inferno raged, and there was no adequate water supply to deal with it, nor was it possible to reverse the fans to draw off the dangerous fumes. On Wednesday the 15th, hopes were raised when 18 men were found alive in the Botanic District, 1,200 yards from pit bottom, but those were the last. On the 16th, hope was abandoned and the fire was ringed by sandbags. By the 20th, the death toll had reached 440, 439 miners and 1 rescuer.
We must always remember that 2 major disasters happened at the Universal Colony. The first one took place on the 24th of May 1901. The tragedy of this explosion brings the lessons learned that the cost of public life were never used to the scale of the 1913 disaster. The report from the Inspector of Mines showed that fire, coal dust and air produced a deadly mixture which could be ignited without a methane gas explosion. Senghenydd was a hot, dry, dusty pit with some 25 degrees higher than the surface readings. The quantities of dust were greatly increased because of the method of loading coal drums and because of the open framework at the ends of the drums. The mines inspector urged all owners to thoroughly water roadways to prevent the danger of explosion and to spray all dusty areas. In 1911, the Coal Mines Act collected together a number of regulations for safety working learned from bitter experience. These were not heeded by the owner and senior management of the Universal Colony, which resulted in such devastating numbers killed in 1913. Thankfully, in the 1901 disaster, this happened at the end of the night shift, when many of the miners had been brought to the surface. There were 82 left underground at the time of the explosion, and only one of these survived. He was William Harris, and he was my grandfather.
A child's memory. I would like to share with you a first-hand account of the 14th of October 1913 and the days that followed, when my grandmother, Elizabeth Saunders, lost her father and uncle in the explosion. This is her story as told to me. I was about 10 and a half, and it was a Tuesday morning. I was out the back with my mother, who was washing at the tub, when all at once the hooter went, and the man next door said, "Mrs. Jones, the pit has gone up." All I remember then is watching my mother. I can still see how she was dressed. I remember it so well. She had a black blouse with a white stripe in it, and she had a long skirt with a lace-up boots, and a canvas apron for washing at the tub. She went through the house, and the last I saw of her was running up the street. The neighbours took my brother and sister, Dan aged 8 and Clarice who was 5, and I ran after my mother. Then I remember being at the top of the pit, and there were crowds and crowds of people. I was only 10 and a half, and I couldn't see my mother. I don't know where she was. I was standing among the people there, and they were bringing up the little boys first, just 14 years of age, from the pit. They were the lucky ones. They were shouting their names as they were bringing them up. I remember it clearly. Later, when I got back home, I wouldn't go to bed. I stayed up with my mother, and then all at once she would have a fit, and she'd say she was going up the pit, and I went with her. We would sit inside, and there was a big fire raging, and there were coffins all around us. There would be things on top of them, perhaps a pair of boots or something to recognise the person by. Then all at once they would shout down that they were fetching another body up, and they'd shout the name of who they thought they were. That went on for days. It was 3 weeks and 3 days before they found my father. When they brought him up, my mother had his coffin opened in the middle of the night, because she wanted to make sure that it was my father. And he was perfect, except the skin had peeled off his face because he had crept into a little hole. He had been gassed, the skin had peeled off his face, but it was my father. I can remember it all so well, and there would be funerals and funerals every day because there were so many men getting buried. My father was buried on a Sunday. My uncle Joseph, my mother's brother, was down 5 weeks before they said they had found him. He was near the chimneys and was in the middle of the fire. He was already a widower and left 2 orphan children. So today I want to remember the 440 men who were killed on the 14th of October 1913, including my great-grandfather David John Jones and my great-uncle Joseph Hopkins. I would also like to remember my great-grandmother Mary Annie Jones, who buried both her husband and her brother from her address in Station Terrace, and my grandmother Elizabeth Saunders, who was only 10 and a half, but has passed the story on to me and my cousins as we grew up.
Father was a miner by William Holden. My father was a miner who worked deep underground. The rush of drums and clanking chains, they were his daily sounds. He worked so far below the ground where coal was hewed by pick. The worked so hard and wages small, he didn't dare go sick. He crawled upon his belly in drifts so low and narrow. The wind it whistled down the shaft, it chilled him to the marrow. He ate his food from a tommy box, shaped like a slice of bread, while squatting down upon the ground where spit and crumbs were shed. His water, it was in a jack, to wet down clouds of dust that gathered in his throat and lungs, where it formed a deadly crust. We would listen for his footsteps. He then came into sight. This man, our dad, as black, just like the darkest night. His bath was always ready, set down in front of fire. My mother then would wash his back and tell us to retire. Right down his back, right rivers ran, amongst the dirt and grime, but you cannot wash away blue scars that you get in the mind. Years have now passed, my father gone, but I am proud to say, my father was a miner until his dying day.
My father, Griffith John, known only as Griff Ginger, was only 4 years old when he lost his father, Charles Brown, aged 31, who lived in lodgings at 23 Piccadilly Road, Senghenydd, when he lost his life in the explosion. Charles worked as a haulier, and these were the men who hauled the necessary materials to where needed, and taking the filled coal drums ready to be taken to the surface. Charles' body was never recovered, and he remains in the darkness of the deep earth beneath our feet. My grandfather Charles and the other 18 men lost their lives, and their bodies were never recovered. May they rest in peace.
Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. Amen. We will have a minute's silence and then the laying of the wreath.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to our dedication service. Bonedigion a bonedigesau, diolch I chi am rando ar ein gwasanaeth gysegri. We will never let these working class men and boys be forgotten. Nawn ni adael i'r dynion a'r bechgyn hyn fynd yn ango. To those mining communities across the world, we will rise again. Mwyn cymunedau global ar draws y byd, fe godwn ni eto. Fe godwn ni eto. Ac yn awr, mae ar yn agor. And now the garden is open.